Okay, good. So I am Alan Rifkin. I'm an attorney. Many years ago, before you were even born, I was appointed by Governor William Donald Schaefer, who was mayor first of the city of Baltimore and then became the governor of the state of Maryland, to be his first legislative transition director. And what that meant is I had all the obligation and the responsibilities of taking his public policies, the things he had campaigned on, things that he thought were important, and translating them into government directives. So that's how we pick up this whole process.
What was it like working with Schaefer?
Unique. I don't quite know how to equate his personality to somebody that you could relate to. He was really a dynamic, impatient, good word, right? Impatient individual who believed very strongly in government doing right by the people, in his view of what was right, but to do it immediately. There was no delay. Things that stood in the way of getting things done were all impediments, and he didn't believe in any impediments, which sometimes led to interesting decisions that he had to make when I would bring him what the law said. And sometimes the law didn't let you move as expeditiously as he wanted to, but he found a way.
Do you have any specific memories of working with him that just kind of stand out all these years?
Oh, many. Do you want me to talk about the stadium or talk about other things? I can tell you one interesting story about all that.
Both would be great.
So early on in my career of being counsel, I ultimately became chief counsel to the governor. After the transition, I then got appointed to be chief counsel and legislative officer to the governor, which was quite a wonderful job to have and to do so. I think I was 28, 29 years old. If I'm not mistaken, I was the youngest chief legislative officer in this, you can bring it in states, in the history of the state. But so I had just had my first child. My wife and I didn't have it. My wife and I had our first child. He's now an attorney here in this law firm, by the way. And he was about a month old at the time I got appointed as chief counsel. And I'm home at night one night, and this is before cell phones. Telephones had cords, if you may recall. And it is the middle of the night, and the phone rings, and it's the governor, and I didn't want to wake up my wife, and I certainly didn't want to wake up my young baby. And so I took the phone as far as the cord would take it out into the hallway, not remembering we had put on the alarm in the house, and the alarms went off, which immediately cut the governor off, which he couldn't understand why I just cut him off in the middle of a phone call. Calling me in the middle of the night had to be important. So I finally was able to get back to him through the switchboard at the mansion, gets him on the phone, starts yelling at me for why did I hang up on him. I told him I didn't hang up on you. The alarm cut the phone off so that the security could come in because you called so late at night. He said, well, I need you down here immediately. So I lived about an hour and a half from the State House. So I got showered, got shaved, got in my car, drove all the way to Annapolis at 4:35 in the morning. I get to see him, I sit down, he tells me what he wants to do, and I said, Governor, you can't do that. That's not constitutional. I can't remember the exact thing he wanted to do, but it wasn't something that could be done. He said, Alan, if I thought I could do it, I wouldn't have called you at 4 in the morning. Tell me how I can do it. And that set off an interesting dynamic in my mind, which is clients don't want to ask you necessarily if they're right or wrong. They want to know how to get something done. And that example that I just gave you, I've told that example many, many times to people because it shows he knew what was right and wrong. He wasn't asking me that. He was asking me to show him a way and a path so that he could accomplish what he wanted to accomplish and do it legally or do it appropriately. And that same thing happened here with the stadium. It was unique, never been done before. At the time of the birth of the Camden Yards project back in 1986, 85, the whole concept of putting a stadium in an urban setting was just unheard of. By that point, through the 60s and the 70s and the early part of the 80s, stadiums were all built in suburban communities. There was some belief that they were easier to reach, more attuned to the growth of suburban America, Highways were a little cheaper to run there. Parking was a little easier to get. There was less expense involved in running infrastructure. All those things led to this enormous growth of suburban stadiums. And they all had basically one thing in common. They were ugly architecture. They were circular discs. People believed in AstroTurf at the time because they could be multi-purpose and they were cheaper to maintain. And consequently, you had all of these stadiums all over the country that were nondescript and also sucking the lifeblood out of the cities. I mean, if you put enough economic activity in the suburbs, the cities start to die. Well, to somebody like William Donald Schaefer, that was just unheard of. He was a mayor first, and frankly, when he was governor, he was still a mayor. His whole mindset was always fill a pothole and people will believe you can do anything. He wasn't the kind of governor with laudable, enormous, esoteric policies. He was a guy who needed to touch and feel and see things. And so to him, the concept of a stadium being built in the suburbs outside of his world of city government and mayoral city government was just an unheard of proposition. So that was all throughout his mindset.
So when he was mayor, or kind of earlier, around 1972, there was discussions of an original stadium in that Camden Yards site. Do you think that influenced him any way in wanting what eventually became?
No, I don't. The timeline is really important for people to understand, and I think when you get done your project, you'll have this laid out very neatly. What happened in March of 1984 changed the whole dynamic with Schaefer. He was mayor of the city at the time. The Colts were owned by a gentleman by the name of Robert Irsay. Irsay was a difficult man on a good day and very, very difficult when he had been drinking or otherwise occupied with other things on his mind. They did not get along. They didn't get along for a whole variety of different reasons, not the least of which was Schaefer could never get him to commit to a long-term lease at Memorial Stadium to keep the Colts. And Schaefer had always had this very, very close relationship with the preceding ownership group of the Colts, Carl Rosenblum and his family. But when Irsay came in, it was like oil and water. And when the Colts started to decline in terms of their wins and losses and successes, Irsay did very little to try to bolster the team because he really was looking for a way out. Didn't like Memorial Stadium, thought they needed a new stadium, didn't like the economics of Baltimore, thought the grass was going to be greener some other place, and really didn't like Schaefer, and Schaefer didn't like him. So all of that ultimately led to a clandestine attempt, which was ultimately fulfilled when Irsay went to Indianapolis on multiple occasions. The press related to the Baltimore viewership, and he was looking for a new home for the Colts. The week before this event where the Colts left town in March of 1984, Schaefer and Irsay met. And during that meeting, Irsay told Schaefer, I'm not leaving, I'm not taking the team out of here. You got my promise on that. And Schaefer went public with that. He said, I just met with Mr. Irsay. He said that the team isn't going to go anywhere, and I believe him. Well, fast forward 1 week later, the snow is falling. It's mid-March. The Mayflower moving vans are pulling away in the early morning hours from the Colts training facility with everything, all the memorabilia, all the Colts equipment, everything pulling out of town. And Schaefer is standing there watching this happen. Not literally there at the event, but standing out front of City Hall watching this happen and getting interviewed. And it was a catastrophic day for him. He felt, one, he had been lied to. Two, he had just lost on his watch one of the biggest assets the community had. This city was in love with the Baltimore Colts. And he was powerless to do anything about it. All of that sort of culminated in his mind to be his worst moment in government and his worst moment as a person. He could not forget it. So when he ran for governor, fast forward now 2 years later, and I was fortunate enough to be on the campaign team working for a guy by the name of Mickey Steinberg, who was the Senate president at the time. He appointed me to be counsel to the campaign, internal counsel. There was an external counsel also, but I was the internal counsel of the campaign. And I got to know Schaefer a little bit, not a lot. He was always on the move, but we did create some bit of a relationship because, I was very interested in what happened with the Colts. I was very interested in sports. So we would talk about that periodically. I had no idea what was going through his mind at the time, but I did know this. The last year that I was counsel to the Maryland Senate under Mickey Steinberg, this would be 1986, the Maryland General Assembly passed a bill which authorized a shell to be created, essentially, for the creation of the Maryland Stadium Authority. It didn't fund it, didn't do anything about it, just simply created a shell. They also authorized funding for what was called the Buddha Commission. This was one of the two commissions that was established to take a look at where a new stadium could be built if there was the interest in building one at all. And there was a big debate over all that because nobody thought that Baltimore was ever going to get another NFL team. The only person who really did was Schaefer. But nobody else really thought it was possible. I mean, once a team left, there was not a lot of historical evidence that a new team would be relocated or an expansion team or anything like that. It was basically you were done. You were one of the relics of the sport, and so be it. But in Schaefer's mind, that was not going to be a sufficient answer. And he had done enough research and enough discussions with those who understood how the NFL worked that he knew that the only way to even get in the dialogue with the NFL would be to commit to build a new stadium and to do so with state-of-the-art facilities. So he knew that in the back of his mind. He also knew at that time, this is now while he's campaigning for governor in '86, that while there's studies going on about what to do about an NFL franchise, that Edward Bennett Williams, who then owned the Orioles at the time, was ill. The Williams family, very, very prominent family from Washington, D.C., had bought the Orioles a number of years earlier. And everybody had always speculated that because Mr. Williams was a very prominent D.C. Attorney, that he was going to move the Orioles to Washington, which had just lost its team to Texas. They had the Washington Senators up until 1972. So basically, D.C. had no baseball team, that he was going to move the Orioles once he gained ownership to D.C. And that would be the end of the sports. Baltimore would be no longer a major league team or a major league city. It would be devoid of both football and baseball. And Schaefer was very concerned on his watch, having lost the Colts, if Williams were to pass away or move the team to D.C. while he was still alive, that he would now lose both franchises. So it was heavy on his mind to make sure that if there was a way to keep the Orioles and was a way to encourage the NFL to come back to Baltimore, he wanted to make that a high priority.
So, you were saying earlier before we started this, the Herb Belgrad story, he comes in, you're the transition person. Is that after Schaefer is elected governor?
Yeah, so Schaefer's elected governor in November of 86. And I get appointed to be chief legislative officer for the transition. I had not yet been told I'm going to be chief counsel and legislative officer during the term. So this is an interim position, happy to take it. And all of a sudden, I've got to start translating all the things he promised into legislation, and I start hiring my staff. A day into this, maybe 2 days, but I think it's the first day into it. I'm at the Preston Street office, which is where we had our transition offices located. Schaefer wanted us all to be in the transition office the morning after the election, which meant some of us never went to sleep. because you're going to celebrate the fact we won. That's a wonderful thing. But he wanted to prove to the people of the state of Maryland that he was on the job and on the job immediately. So we were all to report to the office at 9 a.m. to Preston Street that morning. I'm almost sure, I was in exactly the same suit that I wore the day before. And I walked in. So I'm sitting at my desk, and I think it was that day. It might have been the next day, but my mind tells me it was that day. Sometime around 10 or 11 o'clock that day or the next day, Belgrad comes walking in, Schaefer right behind him. They walk into my office, and they both sit down just like you're sitting right here. And Belgrad's got in his hand a big pamphlet of information. And Schaefer says, Alan, and I don't need to tell you how important it is that we get the Colts back, or football team back to Baltimore, and I don't want to lose the Orioles either. We're going to make as a priority building a new sports complex. And I want you to figure out with Mr. Belgrad here what to do. Mr. Belgrad's been working on it for months now. I think he has a location for it. By that time, the Buddha Commission had reported back 3 locations, which I'll get to in a minute. He wants to describe to you what it is that he thinks we need in order to secure the Orioles and make sure we have a chance to get an NFL franchise. Well, I'm excited. This is a wonderful thing for a young guy like me who likes sports, number one. I'm sitting in a prestigious office, all of 27, 28 years old. This is manna from heaven to a young guy like me, until they tell me what I got to do. So Belgrad starts to explain that unlike prior sports facilities that have been built in various places around the country, his view, having studied it so intently, was that we needed to build 2 stadiums, not one dedicated to football and one dedicated to baseball, unlike the multi-purpose stadiums that had been built up to the time. By 1986, there was only one stadium that was not multi-purpose in the NFL and in baseball, and that was Kansas City. The Kansas City Arrowhead facility was the only one at the time that had one football stadium and one baseball stadium in one complex. When Belgrad told me that, my heart sunk. I had pretty fair appreciation, having lived through the debates over the creation of the Maryland Stadium Authority, just how controversial it would be to build a stadium. Not everybody thought public money ought to go to it. Not everybody thought it was prudent. Not everybody thought we could even afford it. And yet I was being asked now to come up with a plan to build not one, but 2 stadiums, and to do so in a location that had yet to be disclosed to me. Where was it going to go? So I asked Herb a number of questions, like, okay, Herb, where do you think it's going to be located, and do we have the land yet? And his answer was, well, Don wants it, that's Schaefer. Don wants it at Camden Yards. That's one of the 3 locations that Hank Buddha, his commission had identified. They identified Lansdowne, Laurel, and Camden Yards. So Belgrad said, Don wants it at Camden Yards. He doesn't want it outside the city limits. And he thinks that's far enough south that it'll be attractive to Ed Williams, not to think about moving the team. I said, so where is Camden Yards? That was my first question to him. And if you're from Baltimore, the word Camden means New Jersey. Camden Yards to me was the train station in New Jersey, in Camden. I had no idea what Camden Yards was. Nobody had discussed it with me, and I wasn't part of the Buddha Commission, so I didn't really know or hadn't read up on what they had recommended. So they told me where it was, which was a warehouse area that had served the Port of Baltimore for over 100 years. There were a lot of prominent warehouses stacked one beyond the other that would take the goods that would come off of the Pratt Street docks, when we used to have the Pratt Street docks down in Baltimore, and bring the goods over to the warehouses and then put them on the Camden line. The whole reason that you have the Camden line right outside the ballpark is it used to be the north-south line where they would run goods that would come off the docks and then they would connect to all the other lines, railroad lines around the country, and deliver all the goods, to the Midwest and to the South. So I said, that's interesting. Do we have the land yet? Her went, no, that's part of what your task is going to be. I said, okay. Do we have the funding source yet? No, that's going to be part of what your task is going to be. I said, do we know what it's going to cost yet? Well, we have a rough estimate, but that's going to be part of your job to figure that out too. And they went on with all the things that had to be done in order to make the ballpark concept sufficient enough to take it for funding to the Maryland General Assembly. It was a daunting task. To state the most understated thing possible, I had no idea what I was going to do. I had no idea what to do. And frankly, I don't think anybody did, because it had never been done before. So the challenge was immense to try to figure that all out. And of course, they both got up out of their seat. I said, thank you very much, gentlemen. And the governor said, I really need this. It's really important to me. You know how important it is for us to get back a football team. And I know you'll handle it well. I said, well, Governor, let me ask you a question. How much time do I have to put all this together? This is now November. He says, well, I'd like to announce it on Inauguration Day. I said, you can announce what on Inauguration Day? He said, the project and how we're going to do it. Now I think that was 8 weeks. So November, yeah, about 8 weeks, about 8 weeks to do it all. I didn't have a staff yet, much less anything else, or even the information, or anything. So I first started to address the situation by hiring my staff. And the first person I hired was a gentleman by the name of David Iannucci. Turned out to be a godsend. David was the Deputy Director of the Department of Legislative Services at the time. I don't even know that still exists, Legislative Services. But what it was the policy branch of the Maryland General Assembly, and it was the agency that served the General Assembly in developing, implementing the policy, finding the right ways to craft the statutes and the laws to implement what the government wanted to do. It wasn't the funding arm. The funding agency was the Department of Budget and Fiscal Services. I'll get to that in a minute. So I hired David, and I told David what this problem was, or what the governor wanted to accomplish. I can't say a problem, the objective was. And he had the same reaction I had, essentially, which was, oh, really? How are we going to do that? I said, well, that's what you're here for. You're here to help me figure that out. Then we hired a bunch of other folks who were really, really very talented. And we sat down to try to figure out how you're going to do this. First off, you need to acquire the land. You need to have a concept plan for the stadia. You need to price out the concept plan for the stadia. You need to have a mechanism to build the stadia. Then you have to have a funding source to be able to pay for it all. So we broke down the project into basically 3 major categories: the authorization, the funding, and the acquisition. Each had their own separate set of issues that were incredibly difficult as a matter of law and also a matter of financing. But that's how we approached it, and then started to come up with the ways and means by which we thought we could do all of that. Much of it was incredibly controversial, and we knew it would be controversial. To acquire the land meant you had to displace, I want to say it was 63 warehouse owners and property parcel owners who were doing business at the time. I mean, these weren't out of business enterprises. This wasn't a brownfield. These were legitimate businesses that were operational. So we had to create a boundary called the Camden Yards District. Then we needed to empower somebody within that district to have eminent domain authority, so they could take the land if the land couldn't be negotiated. And then we had to create the funding mechanism, and we had to then create the actual concept. Let me back up a minute. There was one other part of the conversation I had that day with Mr. Belgrad and the governor, I said to them, how are we going to pay for this? You know, direct question, how are we going to pay for that? How do you envision we're going to pay for this? And Schaefer said, well, that's something you're going to have to figure out, but please know you may not use any tax dollars. You can't use any general funds. Well, when you tell somebody that they have to fund something of that magnitude, but you can't use taxpayer funds, it's almost an impossible task. Because the only funds government really has are general funds. You pay your taxes, your sales tax, or your income tax, or your corporate tax. Those are all called general funds. That's 90% of what governments have. They get federal money also, but that's considered general funds also. Couldn't use that. And generally, federal funds are earmarked. You can only use them for particular purposes. So what was left was a small bucket of things called discretionary funds. But even they were not sufficient, and they had already been spoken for 150 different ways from the legislature. So that was one of the hardest things we had to figure out to do, was how are you going to pay for it? And I'll get into that in a minute, because I stumbled more times than I was successful, but ultimately it worked out. So that's the lineage of how we get to this impossible task.
And then,
Keep going. Is it okay if I have you adjust your mic really quickly?
Sure. Is it falling down?
It's just like rubbing against your shirt, so I don't want it
Okay,
to.
is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you so much.
Sure, my
Sorry.
pleasure.
Go ahead, you guys.
Mhm.
so fast forwarding from there a little bit, getting more to 1987, going to the Annapolis hearing.
Oh, a lot happens before that in the Annapolis hearing.
Let's fill in
yeah,
that time period.
yeah.
What
The-
happens to lead
well,
up of that hearing?
Well, not to steal the thunder about the hearing, but the hearing almost never happened. But so let me backtrack, because I think that is a good it's a good path to follow. So after a lot of late nights and research and analysis, David and I and the others on my team, along with Herb Belgrad's good input, did come up with the 3 buckets of statutory authorizations that we thought we would need. In the first bucket, the acquisition of the properties, we knew that we could never get the project done on ordinary eminent domain. The way eminent domain works is you negotiate with a landowner. Say you want to put a road in front of their property or on their property. The government negotiates with the landowner for the fair market value of the property. The landowner can say yes or no. And if the landowner says no, the government has the authority to go to court and seek to take the property, and then the court sets the fair market value. There is a long history in this country of opposition to governmental taking of people's property, for all the reasons you'd expect. It is incredibly controversial to say, I'm going to build a school here, so I need your house, or I need your business. And so there's a huge pushback to limit the government's authority as to where and how and under what circumstances it can take somebody's property away from them, regardless of the fact they're paying fair market value. It doesn't make a difference. And it can take years. And the landowner has the right to appeal, which could take even more years. So when we brought that to Governor Schaefer and told him that, we can give this new authority we're creating, the Maryland Stadium Authority, which was a template, we can fill it in with all kinds of powers. We can give it the power of eminent domain. But Governor, please understand, I know you want to get this thing built as quick as you can. You want these stadiums to come online so that you can keep the Orioles in town and also be in line for the expansion of the NFL, which was within a 2 or 3 year period. I actually have that here. I've got that around here somewhere, which I'll show you. Oh, here it is. This was I'll show you this later on. This was the pamphlet or the brochure that was given out to the NFL during the expansion efforts. But it's going to take forever with eminent domain. He says, well, is there an option? I said, yeah, but it is incredibly nuclear and incredibly controversial, more so than even eminent domain. It's called quick take. Quick take is a rare type of eminent domain. What quick take is used for is in a state of emergency, like when the Key Bridge came down, if you needed to immediately get to a road to the bridge and there was a landowner there, you can't wait 3 years to get all the crews in to take the bridge down. You've got to have your access point. And so there's a thing called quick take eminent domain. Quick take reverses the roles. In quick take eminent domain, the government takes the land first, and then you go to court on only one thing, which is the fair market value, if you can't agree on the price. So it has no appellate process other than as to price. Meanwhile, from day one, the government has your land. Well, think about that for a minute. There is no way to sugarcoat how controversial that is. Schaefer said, do it. I said, okay. It could sink the entire ship. He says, do it. So we put into the authorization bill for the Stadium Authority the limited ability of quick take within the parameters we had just defined called Camden Yards. I thought that was going to be the end of this project. I thought the minute that bill became public and the minute that the conservative elements of the Maryland General Assembly saw it, the people that were pro-property and against eminent domain, that in and of itself was going to sink this entire project. And I told the governor that, and he said, do it. So we did it. We put it in the bill. Then we, in terms of giving the Stadium Authority other authorities, we gave them the ability to construct the stadium, to procure the materials and the developing agencies and the construction companies and the architects and the engineers to map out what the stadium would be and look like. And we did another controversial thing. We eliminated the procurement laws. Under Maryland law, ordinarily, when the government procures, buys goods and services, it has to do a thing called competitive bidding. You get a chance to bid on it, you get a chance to bid on it, everybody gets a chance, and the best offeror with the best price or the best services wins. But that takes time, because not only do you have to put an RFP out on the streets and people have to respond to it, but then the losing bidders have a right to protest and appeal, and that can take years. So I explained that to the governor that we can. How do you want the Maryland Stadium Authority to obtain the construction services, the architects, the engineers, and the like? Explain to him the issues with regard to the procurement system. He said, eliminate the procurement system. Let them pick who they think they need. Just make sure they do it reasonably, and they do it with the state's best interests at heart. So I put those words in. Thought, okay, if quick take didn't sink the bill, that's going to sink the bill, because that means you have a government agency that can play favorites, can hire who they want, when they want, with nobody looking over their shoulders, no right of protest. Okay, so now we've got in each one of the first two bills something that's incredibly controversial. Now we go to the third bill. Third bill, which is the design, pricing, funding. How are we going to fund it? So my first effort at funding it was to figure out how much this stadium was going to cost. So we went to a number of engineers and architects. I want to say we went to Mascaro. I can't remember who we went to first. We placed in front of some very prominent architectural, RTKL. I can't remember who we used. This is before HOK came on. HOK comes on a little bit later on. And we said, give us a generalized price for what you think something like this would cost. Forget about the cost of the land. We think we can figure out what the cost of the land is, because we had a fair market value assessment done on that by an appraiser for those 63 parcels. And we asked, well, how much do you think it would cost to build these two stadiums? And they gave us what they thought it would cost. So we used that as our very, very rough template of what we would need to raise in terms of funding to pay for it. The challenge there was what to use, how to get the money, where would it come from? And so I started to scour along with a gentleman by the name of Bill Ratchford. Bill Ratchford was he's now deceased, but a brilliant, incredibly brilliant fiscal analyst. He was the director of the Department of Fiscal Services. I'd gotten to know him when I was counsel to the Maryland Senate. And I picked his brain about where are there discretionary opportunities to raise capital and funds. And he said, well, there's a bunch of different things, and he gave me a list, one of which was the liquor tax, beer and wine tax, which hadn't at the time been raised for almost 25 or 30 years. The beer and wine lobby is pretty strong. And the excise tax that was placed on beer and wine had been pretty much stagnant as a fixed number for decades. So I'm thinking to myself, well, what better to tax? I mean, you go to a ball game, you're going to drink a beer, maybe have a glass of wine or whatever it happens to be. Why can't we place a heavy premium tax on those kinds of consumptions? Therefore, it's not a general sales tax, it's not general funds, and it's driven by the actual people consuming the value of the use of the ballpark. It seemed rational to me, and so I went public with that. To say that my head got dented in within 36 hours is another understatement. The beer and wine lobby went absolutely nuts on me personally, and also on the governor and the administration. To which the governor called me into his office and said, "Why'd you do that? You didn't run that one by me. I could have told you right off the bat that wasn't going to happen." Well, being young and naive, I didn't know. Mistake on my part. But then that meant I had to go back to the drawing board again. And I came up with another idea and another idea. Whatever it was there was always some special interest group that just knocked it down. To the point where Sandy's old newspaper wrote a story saying that I was going to tax cauliflower and vegetables next in my long-winded attempt to try to find a way to pay for this thing. And meanwhile, if you can't find a way to pay for it, you don't have anything. You got nothing. So finally, about, I would say, 2 months into the term, the governor already announced that we were going to be doing all this at his inauguration. But about 2 months into the term, Ratchford and I met again, and I said, "Bill, I'm just dying on the vine here. I can't find a way to pay for this." He says, "Well, let me think about it. There's got to be a way. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you." And a couple of days later, Ratchford came into my office in the State House. He said, "I think I got an idea. We can charge Baltimore City a fixed fee because they're going to get the spin-off benefit of the stadium on an annual basis. So let's suppose we charge them $1 million to $1.5 million a year." Oh, by the way, I should have pointed out, we had figured out that the cost of the stadium was X, stadiums was X. We didn't need the football money yet, so we paired that off. We knew we'd come back to that later. We got the land, we'll come back to the funding, we'll create the funding sources, but we won't grab the money yet. So the football stadium sort of came off the books, even though it was authorized. So all we then were dealing with was the baseball stadium. We knew what the baseball stadium in very rough terms would cost. We knew what the cost of what's called debt service was on bonds, and we could then extrapolate what we would need on 20-year bonds on an annual basis to pay for the bonds to pay for the stadium. You following this? Okay. So basically we figured out what the mortgage would be and what we would need annually to pay off the mortgage. That's what bonds essentially would do. So we knew what we had to do in any one particular year, and I think if I'm not mistaken, the number was $13.4 million that we needed annually to build the baseball stadium. So how were we going to get the $13.4 million? So Ratchford said, well, let's get $1.5 million from the city as a fixed fee contribution. We'll take that out of their budget, or we just won't send the money to them. State government sends money to local governments. You could always peel off $1.5 million before they ever got it. So that was $1.5 million on that end of it. Now we're down to somewhere around $12 million. Ratchford said, if we were to expand the lottery and make a user lottery game for stadium aficionados, that would not be, I would not characterize that as a general fund. We could hold it back from ever going into the general funds and create a separate repository for that particular game. Maybe we could generate some money there. Let me study that. So he came up with 2 scratch-off games added to the Maryland Lottery that we did projections on and believed would raise around $12 million. So you take that 12 million, you add it to the $1.5 million, and in a very non-accounting manner, you could generalize we had enough money to do it. So bingo, we had a plan. Then we tied all 3 bills together so that one bill could not pass unless the other bills passed. They were all made cross-conditional on each other, which wound up saving us from a referendum many years later. But we tied everything together, and now we had our package. So that takes you up until, I've got the picture of that actually. Bear with me for a second. Would you try to get Stacy real quick?
We can show the picture later.
Yeah, I can find it for you. I actually have the picture of us with the bills being taken for filing. Yeah, I'll find it for you. I have it. So here we have now the bills. They are introduced into the legislature. So now they are what is called in process for purposes of hearings, evaluation, passage or defeat. And this is now maybe February of the first year of our term. And then the fun begins.
So we get to that fun.
Yes.
So
Like this all hasn't been fun up to this point. It really has.
It
It really has been actually. So.
Leave it to March.
Uh-huh.
What was the mood of the governor
In March?
or
In February?
In February, kind of lead up to the hearing?
Well, by the time we dropped the bills into the legislature, the governor was in active warfare with the legislature. And they were in active warfare with him. For reasons that are kind of hard to imagine, everybody was of the same party. They were all Democrats, by and large. But the factions within the Democratic Party were such that they were geographical. The Southern Maryland contingent led by Senate President Mike Miller and the Western Maryland contingent led by Kaz Taylor and others at the time, the Speaker, were not talking to one another. They each had their different agendas. Schaefer's agenda was Baltimore City. There was a lot of controversy among them all, and they were not getting along at all. And that culminated in an event that almost derailed everything. The state of Maryland, because of some change in federal law, had what was called a tax windfall. I want to say it was about $600 or $700 million, which is a lot of money, and then was even by its own terms at that time an enormous amount of money. And there was a lot of debate on what to do with that tax windfall. The Southern Maryland contingent, the Western Maryland contingent, which were very powerful contingents because they ran both the House and the Senate, wanted the money returned to the taxpayers as a tax rebate. Schaefer wanted to keep the money for government purposes, not the least of which is he wanted to keep it for the city. Frankly, I wanted a piece of that for the stadium, but that was off limits because it was general fund money or dedicated funds, couldn't get to it. So Schaefer was steadfast in telling the legislature that money is going to be used for the city, for infrastructure, for schools, for public purposes. They were adamant saying, no way, that money is going back to the people and so forth. So I had to broker a settlement between the parties. And after lots and lots and lots of hard work of getting the various constituents to talk to one another, because they were not, there was a lot of animosity built up by that point in time, I got a meeting together with the Senate President, Speaker of the House, and the Governor to work out their differences, because I was told directly from the Senate President, if we don't work this out, if we don't get the tax windfall figured out, you are not going to get a hearing on your stadium bills. You can tell Schaefer he can stick that one where the sun doesn't shine. And I'm sugarcoating what he said to me. So I believed him. So I finally get them all together in the governor's office, and we come up with a settlement. Governor was going to keep a third for state purposes. 2/3 was going to go back to the people in a tax rebate. We go down to the first floor of the State House for a press conference to announce it. While we are announcing it, a delegate by the name of Paul Weisengoff, who was the head of the Baltimore City delegation, goes upstairs to the governor's office. He says, Governor, I hear what you just did, but that's not going to be sufficient for the Baltimore City delegation. We want at least half. He says, okay, fine, you got half. So while we're having the press conference announcing that 2/3 is going to go back to the people of the state of Maryland in a tax rebate, and 1/3 is going to be kept by the state for state purposes, Weisengoff is telling the press just the opposite. The implications of that were volcanic. At the time, everybody had real phones like this on their desks. The Senate President had a real phone like this, but believe it or not, it was actually red. There's a thing called a red phone. You probably heard about this, like from Get Smart days. But the Senate President, Speaker of the House, each had dedicated telephones that went only one place. That's to the governor's office. They could pick up the red phone. It would buzz on the governor's desk. He would know to pick it up or not pick it up. Mike Miller, Senate President, after Weisengoff made this announcement, which made us all look like fools during the press conference, calls me into his office. He's steaming. And Sandy will explain to you that this was a man who, when he got angry, was just volcanic in his reactions, and powerful and difficult. I happen to like him a lot, but you had to understand him a lot. Pulls me in his office. He goes, I like you, but let me tell you something right now. Your son of a bitch, Governor, he just screwed your stadium. And you can tell him this from me. And he takes the telephone that's in the wall and he rips it out of the wall, where the tail, this piece, is hanging. He hands it to me and he goes, give this to him and tell him what I think. So I'm carrying a telephone up the steps to State House into the governor's office, knock on the governor's door, I'm holding the telephone. I walk in and he says, now what? I said, Governor, I think we got a big time problem. Did you tell Delegate Weisengoff that it was not 2/3, 1/3, but 50-50? He says, yeah, why? I said, well, here's Senate President Miller's reaction. And I hand him a telephone. So Schaefer, after he gets done viscerally responding to having that kind of a reaction from the Senate President, says, well, what do you think we should do? I said, well, I think you need to get the Senate President and the Speaker up here immediately into your office. I said, you've got to tell him that you rescind what you said to Weisengoff, and we've got to unwind this thing, or everything's going to get killed, everything, including the stadium. Now, remember, we're now into mid-February. Session's halfway over. We haven't had a hearing yet. So after a lot of cajoling, and Lainey Lebo, who was his right-hand person, lovely lady, really played a huge role in peaceably trying to do what I couldn't do, which was to get Senate President and Speaker of the House to come to the governor's office. Come up to the governor's office. Can I tell this whole story? Sure. It kind of gets a little graphic. It is, by the way, in the book, in Fraser's book. So, well, I'm going to try not. I will be euphemistic. Okay. You don't want to know the whole graphic. Anyway, so they come up to, that is the Senate President, Speaker of the House, come up to the governor's office. And the governor's office is laid out a little bit like this, except where Sandy is right now is a sofa. 2 seats are in front of the governor's desk. Governor sits here. Senate President sits in one of the chairs in front of the governor's desk. Speaker sits in the other. I'm on the couch. Lainey Lebo is on the couch, and Mark Wasserman, I believe. No, Darrell Levy is on the couch. We're all sitting there. And the meeting began somewhat like this. You could have cut the tension with a knife. It was so tense in that meeting. Governor gets up from his desk and walks around to right in front of the two chairs, sits on the edge of the desk, pulls his zipper down, this is no lie, and grabs himself in a very unnatural way in front of the two of them. And he says, "Will you let go?" The reaction from the two of them was first astonishment that a governor was doing this, and then they broke into laughter, which cut the tension immediately. He said, "I apologize. I made a mistake, and I don't make a lot of mistakes. Let it go." And the two of them looked at each other, and they were just shaking their heads. And I'm thinking to myself, that was a command performance. That was absolutely a command performance. And as they walk out, I walked out with them, and I said, "Are we good now?" And they said, "We don't even know how to react." But the fact that they weren't ready to kill each other, and he had broken the ice and gotten them actually to be astonished and laugh, did actually break the ice. The 50-50 was gone, the 2/3, 1/3 was enacted, and that issue was cleared off the decks. Now, you would have thought that having gone through that turmoil, we would then be next in line to have our stadium bills heard. But oh no, there was another hurdle, and it was thrown up by those that were against the stadium, including the Senate president, who was dead set against the stadium, who had been looking for any reason, tax included, to try and stop the project from going forward because he didn't think it was a good use of money and didn't do a thing for Southern Maryland, said to me and said to the governor, "We've told you before, until Edward Bennett Williams, who's the owner of the Orioles, says that he has to or wants to have a new stadium, why are we investing in it in the first place?" That was a big challenge because Williams didn't want to be like Bob Irsay. Remember I described Bob? He didn't want to be someone who was threatening to leave if he didn't get a stadium. On the other hand, he didn't like playing at Memorial Stadium, thought it was an old, decrepit, downtrodden facility, which it was. And he would only agree to 1-year leases, not an extended lease, which always kept the pressure on the state and on the city that he could leave at any time at the end of any season. So the legislature, before it would put money into a new stadium, wanted to hear from the owner, and it's a very legitimate thing. If we build this stadium, will you commit to a long-term lease? Otherwise, why are we wasting our money? If we're going to build a stadium and you're just going to move to DC or to some other place, then we've wasted our money and we've wasted our political capital and we've done a lot for nothing. Very legitimate thing to ask. Williams would not do it. Williams' view was, I don't want to have anything to do with this, but if you build, if you fund a new stadium, then come back to me and we can have that discussion. But he would not go public with it. So as a consequence, the Senate and the House refused to have a hearing. All throughout March, can't get a hearing. All throughout February, can't get a hearing. First week of March, can't get a hearing. Second week of March, can't get a hearing. And I can't get a hearing for this one straw man that's been put up, unless they hear directly from Edward Bennett Williams that he wants a stadium, unless he's willing to come to Annapolis and testify to that fact and willing to commit to a long-term lease, there will not be a stadium hearing. And each week at our cabinet meetings, when I give the update to the cabinet, including to the governor, high on the agenda is every one of our legislative bills. I think we had 35 or so, some of which had passed by then, some of which were in process. But all of the time, the answer about the stadium was, Governor, it's not moving. There's no effort to have a hearing. Nothing's been scheduled, and I can't get it scheduled until they hear from Williams. And I know you've already told me that he's not going to do what they want. Go to a press conference in the third week of March. Governor would do a press conference every Wednesday or Thursday. I never can remember which one it is. One day was cabinet, one day was his press conference. Either it was a Wednesday or Thursday morning. And in those days, the governor would have his press conference in the ceremonial room. Press would all line up, ask everything they wanted to ask. The cameras were rolling, and he would, parry as he felt he needed to or say what he wanted to do. As this particular press conference was coming to an end, he says, "Oh, I have one more thing to announce. Edward Bennett Williams will be here next week and prepared to testify next," I think he said Thursday, or Wednesday or Thursday, and answer any questions the legislature has. We need to get this stadium bill moving, and he will come down and say what he needs to say. I thought, my God, that's fabulous news. So when the press conference ended, I went back into his office, walked in, and I said, "Governor, that's fantastic news. How did you get Mr. Williams to agree?" He said, "I haven't. Give him a call. He might want to know before the press calls him."
Not to interrupt you, but so I interviewed Iannucci earlier this summer. He was there, and he said that, quote, what the governor said to both of you is that, girls, you got a phone call to make. And so what was kind of like just your reaction to
He may have said it that way. I don't remember the exact words. David's memory might be more etched in stone about exactly what he said than that, but that was the essence. That was the absolute essence of it, which is you better reach him, you better tell him. Now, there's a genius to what he just did, which I'll get to in a minute. But so David and I walked back into the office, and I placed a call to Williams. At the time, because it's mid-March, it's spring training. So Williams is in Fort Lauderdale. And when I call his office, his secretary says, "Well, he's in spring training. He's at the spring training venue. I think he's on the back fields. There's no way I can reach him." And I asked him, "Please, before he talks to any press, whatever the reason may be, would you please have him call me? It's urgent." And his secretary, very sweet lady, I can't remember her name, said she would do just that. Well, several hours go by, and it's near the end of the day, and the phone rings, and I believe my secretary had left already, and her name was Jen. And just David and I are left in the office when the phone rings. And I am forever grateful for the fact that David answered the phone, not me. Apparently, and I was standing next to David, David got an earful. And the earful, as he and I laugh about, was the longest continuous sentence without a verb ever uttered in the English language. But the message was crystal clear. How dare you guys do what you just did? And oh, by the way, I'm not available next week, either the Wednesday or Thursday that the governor announced. I'm having chemotherapy treatment in Boston. Jump in a lake, essentially. Click. So David looks at me and he goes, "Now what, boss?" I said, "David, I haven't the foggiest idea what to do now. I really don't. But let me give Larry Lucchino a call, and let me see if I can work something out with Larry." Larry was Edward Bennett Williams' partner at Williams and Connolly, and also his right-hand person with the Orioles. Brilliant, wonderful, talented man. One of my all-time favorite human beings. He became a mentor of mine over the years. Brilliant, beyond comprehension, dedicated. Wound up being president of the Orioles. Then he wound up being an owner of the San Diego Padres. He wound up being an owner of the Boston Red Sox. He and I stayed friendly ever since. He passed away about a year ago. Just a wonderful gentleman, every possible way, but also very demanding. So I got a hold of Larry, and Larry had already heard the whole story from Williams. He says, "Ed is really angry." I said, "Geez, I would be too, Larry. I didn't realize that the governor really hadn't made that call." He goes, "It's a setup, Alan. It's an absolute setup." And part of the genius was it was a setup. Schaefer, I'm sure, in his calculus, because he was a brilliant politician, came to the following conclusion. If Williams won't testify and the stadium bills die, which is my biggest priority, I'm not going to be the fall guy for when it fails. It's going to fail because Williams didn't come and testify, not because I couldn't get it done. So he put Williams between a rock and a hard place. Now, I will tell you that Schaefer denies that he ever had this conversation with me and David. He denies that he didn't have Williams' approval ahead of time, all of which is because he didn't want to offend anybody once the entire story came out. But you'll read it. It's in the Fraser biography where Schaefer said to me that my telling of the story is not accurate, but David was with me, and this is this is really what happened. But that's okay, and I understand why he would say what he says. Regardless, we didn't have any commitment whatsoever that Williams was going to be there, but we weren't about to tell that to the legislature, because if we had told that to the legislature, we would have had nothing. So meanwhile, David and I go about the path of setting up the hearing. We want to make sure the hearing is late in the day, because if he really does have chemotherapy treatment in the morning, we want to make sure it's later in the day. We want to make sure we have all of our ducks lined up, all of our witnesses, all the things you would have to do in a major hearing like this. And we may or may not have our star witness. If we don't have our star witness, you might as well write it off. It's dead. So I get a call back from Lucchino later in the week. I think it was Friday. It actually wasn't Friday. And he said, Alan, I have no idea whether Ed's going to do this or not. Frankly, he's still very, very angry, and he has not canceled his chemotherapy appointment, so that should tell you all you really need to know. He said, but if he were to agree to show up, and he were to agree to testify, what kind of questions might he be asked? I said, we'll take care of that, Larry. We will send you a list. He goes, don't make it long, 10 at the most. Send me some questions. So I turned to David. I said, David, could you just do me a favor? Just dictate or write out a series of questions, 10 at the most, that are the 10 questions that Williams is most likely to be asked. Would you do that? And he said he would. For reasons that now escape me, largely because I had a bigger agenda and 1,000 other things to do, and I knew David was so capable, I never looked at the list of questions.
So what David said was that there's 22 questions.
Could have been.
A lot more
Yeah.
than 10. And it was the question 22 was the big.
I'm going to get to that one. I will get to that one. I don't remember it being 22. But nevertheless, whatever number of questions it was a limited number of questions. And I asked David to do it, and I didn't look at it. I had 1,000 other things to do, and I trusted David implicitly. So David wrote the questions that you would naturally hear and faxed it up to Larry. Didn't hear anything over the weekend, didn't hear anything Monday morning. Sometime late on Tuesday, I get a call from Larry that Williams will, in fact, be there. I don't know what condition he's going to be in. He will just have chemotherapy treatment, but he will be there. So that was manna from heaven to hear that he actually was going to do this. And so we arranged to meet at the mansion. The governor gave us the dining room so that we could comfortably have Williams rest a little bit when he flew in, have some lunch, talk to him a little bit, and take him over to the joint hearing room for the hearing. So as David and I are walking over, having heard back from the state troopers that Williams had landed, we walked past Mickey Steinberg, Lieutenant Governor, David and I, and Mickey says to us, where are you guys going? And we said, well, we're going to the mansion to prepare Mr. Williams for the hearing, to which Mickey Steinberg breaks out in laughter. He says, the two of you are going to brief the greatest lawyer in America? I don't think so, but have fun and enjoy yourself with him, which was sort of an appropriate reaction. I mean, the man was the greatest lawyer in this country. And here are two little pipsqueaks that are walking over there to try to pretend like we know what we're going to do to help him understand what he has to do. But when you're young, you think you know what you're talking about. So we get to the mansion, we wait a little bit. Williams comes in with Larry, and he is really weak. He's ashen, doesn't have any energy. We sit him down at the dining room table, ask him if he wants anything to eat. He says, no, thank you. And then he looks up in some portion of that conversation, and he said, who wrote the question, what's going to happen to the team when I die? Who had the audacity to write that question? Meanwhile, I hadn't looked at the list. I wouldn't have changed it. Don't misunderstand me. And that question was being asked, and being asked regularly of both David and me, because at the end of the day, if they were to do all this, and he was to die and the family was going to take over the team, what control would the state have over them moving the team under the estate? Very legitimate question, but I can understand how someone who had just had chemotherapy treatment isn't going to take very kindly to what's going to happen after you die. So, so I turned to David. I said, David, you want to explain that question to Mr. Williams? And David, to his everlasting credit, the gentleman that he is, explained the question. And he said, you could probably anticipate that you're going to be asked that question. I don't care. I can't believe anybody asked me that question. Okay. So we get to the hearing, and we're really legitimately walking Mr. Williams arm in arm to make sure he can get to the joint hearing room. And the joint hearing room has a incline or a decline as you walk down to the hearing table. And I am holding him because we're sitting next to each other. I'm going to be at the table. At the hearing table was to my right was Herb Belgrad, then me, then Mr. Williams. I think David might have been at the other end of the table. And so I had the responsibility of introducing the bill, introducing the package, explaining what the package was, then introducing Williams and Belgrad for their testimony. So we sit down, and I'm thinking to myself, how in the world is this man going to be able to weather the next 2 hours of this political storm that's going to happen? And it was a joint hearing between the House and the Senate. It was recorded, which I have a video of, which I think I gave you guys. It was a monumental moment. Everyone knew of all of the ins and outs and the intrigue and everything else that went into this last moment in time to get Schaefer's #1 priority heard, much less hopefully passed, that this was the moment. And either Camden Yards was going to survive or Camden Yards was going to die as to how that hearing went. The pressure was enormous on everyone. I felt very comfortable, though. For some reason, at that hearing, I felt that this was going to be the crowning moment of the entire process. If Mr. Williams could elevate to the job of being the star witness that we needed him to be, if he was going to say what needed to be said. So I get done my part of it all, introduce Mr. Williams, and Williams then begins a 30-minute or so monologue that is one of the best public speeches I have ever heard in my life. Contrary to the fact that he was ill, weak, clearly nearer the end than the beginning of his life, and under the enormous pressure of the moment, the man rose like the phoenix and was astonishing. His first thing that he says as he gets up is, you all want to know what I have to say about the stadium, but it isn't about me. It's about you. And he holds up there was a Sports Illustrated cover in that particular week of all fortunate things that could possibly have happened that benefited our ability to get this done. Sports Illustrated decides to put on the cover of its preseason magazine, the Three Ripkins of Baltimore. That was the headline, the Three Ripkins of Baltimore. At the time, Cal Ripken Sr. was the manager of the Orioles. Cal Ripken Jr. was the superstar rising, soon-to-be Hall of Famer, and his brother was the second baseman, Billy Ripken. And they're sitting on the, posed in the front under the banner of the Three Ripkins of Baltimore. And Williams holds that up, as any great lawyer would do, in a sort of a prop that said, this is what it's about. It's about the 2 million people that are looking at this magazine today. It's about the publicity for Baltimore, for the state of Maryland, for the citizens, something to believe in, and on he goes. And then he explains why a new stadium is needed, why the world of economics of sports needs club seats and premium seating, and how Camden Yards doesn't do that. On he goes. Just pitch perfect, brilliant oratory. and captivating. You could hear a pin drop in that room. And when he gets done speaking, I open it up to questions for Mr. Williams, and he says, I'll take any questions you all may have. And one of the early questions comes from Julian Lapidus, the Baltimore City senator who was against the stadium, who was always a thorn in everybody's side, difficult human being. But he begins by saying, I admire you, Mr. Williams. I have followed your career. He's also a lawyer, Lapidus. But I have one question to ask you. What's going to happen to this team when you pass away? And if you look at the video, I turn to David. I'm thinking to myself, thank God that question was on that list. And he handled it like a charm. Brilliantly handles the question. And by the way, Williams knew that question was going to be asked. He did that to control the room when he came into the dining room at the prep session to prove who was the alpha dog and who was supposed to be the guy sitting on the back. That was all part of how he controlled a room, and he controlled our room for sure when he did that. And then the hearing was a grand success. Nobody asked anything of any significance about the eminent domain quick take. Nobody asked anything of any great significance about the funding mechanism. Nobody asked anything of any great significance about the fact that the procurement law wasn't going to be followed. There were some private conversations with legislators about it, but it didn't become the firestorm because everything had been so focused on whether Williams would testify, whether we would break the chain of the issues on the tax rebate, that those things, as significant as they were at the outset, sort of became just background noise. And then it passed.
So after it passes, what's kind of like just the next day? What was the next day for you?
The next day there was a bill signing. Schaefer and the Senate President and the Speaker organized a very quick bill signing where they had big blow-up footballs and baseballs, and the Oriole bird was there. It was kind of like, this is spectacular. This is what all the hard work has been about to get it to that point. But you know, as I said the last time, I'll say it again, you know, this time, hopefully it stays to be recorded. But it's never would have happened without Herb Belgrad, without Larry Lucchino's participation, without David. There were so many people that played such a role in getting it from A to Z. I get a lot of credit for it all, but by no means it wasn't me. This was a very shared success among a lot of very dedicated people.
Speaking of Larry Lucchino, like what was it like just working with him?
Well, then I wound up working with him for another 20 years thereafter. Then I learned a lot, to be honest about it. Larry was the kind of lawyer I always wanted to be at that young age. I wanted to be someone that had that kind of gravitas, had that kind of insight, knew how to navigate both government, law, business, and do it in a way that had some grace to it. I saw him as a terrific role model, and understand he did not get angry. He knew that Edward Bennett Williams was angry, but he didn't try to use Williams' anger somehow as a leverage between me and David and the governor. He knew he was smart enough to know just why Schaefer did what he did. What I think Williams was angry about is that Schaefer did what he did because it was the perfect thing to have done. And Williams had only one move on the chessboard at that point. And I think that's why Williams got upset, because for a man who likes to control the dynamic, control the room, control the audience, Williams was down to one move on the chessboard.
You know, and with Larry, there's a lot of people who kind of dealt with him from the periphery, or with lease negotiations or everything, had a view of him as a very demanding person and almost a little challenging to work with. Did you ever see that side?
Oh, sure. Demanding is an understatement. If you called the ballpark a stadium, he chewed you out because it wasn't a stadium; it was a ballpark. Just little things that were big things to him, but he was detail-oriented, difficult, yes. but not difficult to be demeaning, difficult to be successful in a very productive manner. People, even when he chewed you out or whatever, you still had great admiration for him. You understood why he was doing it. So anyway.
And fast forward a little bit further, and so closer to when Camden Yards is actually being completed, the next kind of controversy was the name of the stadium.
You think?
So, like, how did those factions kind of play out?
After I left the governor's office, one of my first clients was the Orioles. In those days, there wasn't this thing called a cooling off period. Good news, or I probably would have been unemployed. But you could hire somebody who just left government even if you had a matter before them in government. I just couldn't work on a specific thing that I'd worked on then. So I couldn't have worked on the funding or the authorization of Camden Yards, but I could work on anything else related to it. I could work on the development of the project. I could work on the naming of the project, whatever it happens to be. So Lucchino called me up and said, this is pretty close after I'd left government, and he asked, can I work on the project with them in the development stage? And I said yes, so they hired me. About a year into that, and I can't remember if Williams was still alive at the time, or whether it was Eli Jacobs. I don't remember who the ownership group was at the time. But the issue came up about the naming of Camden Yards. And so Larry said to me, we got a problem. We are at odds with Don, he referred to Schaefer as Don, over the naming of Camden Yards, naming of the ballpark. I said, okay, what are the parameters here? Who's saying what? He said, well, we want Oriole Park. I said, well, that makes sense to me, but just help me understand why so I can explain the why. Because, well, we want to throw back to a historical time, and we want to connect this new ballpark to its historical lineage. And the original Oriole Park, original place where the Orioles played was called Oriole Park, and actually was a wood structure that burned down in the 1930s. But it was nonetheless part of the history and lore of the name Orioles. And we think that because we're trying to do a throwback stadium, having that name will be very valuable as a connection to the lineage of the ball club. This is long before naming rights were a big thing. I said, okay, what does the governor want? He says, the governor wants Camden Yards. I said, Camden Yards again? This is now the second time in my career that the word Camden Yards has taken on an importance that's far beyond anything anybody growing up in this area would have ever thought. I said, no, he doesn't. So Larry said, yeah, that's what he's saying. I said, no, Larry, you're missing the point. He doesn't want it called Camden Yards. He wants it called William Donald Schaefer Stadium. He said, I know that. He said, has he ever said that to you, Larry? He goes, no. So I said, what do you want me to do? He goes, would you go meet with him and see if you can iron this out? So I go meet with the governor, exchange all kinds of pleasantries. We remained very good friends even after I left government, and thought the world of him then, like I did when I worked for him. And I said, Governor, I'm a little confused about what's going on with the name. The Orioles want the name you'd expect. Oriole Park, Oriole Park, it's the lineage of the club. You don't really want Camden Yards. Nobody even knows what that is. He said, yes, I do. I said, no, you don't. He says, yes, I do. I said, Governor, please. If I were guessing, and I know you'd never say this, but if I were guessing, I would think you'd want, and rightly so, the ballpark named after you. I mean, after all, it never would have happened without you. I didn't say that. I said, I know you didn't say that. I said, but would that be a fair assumption if I were to think that? And the governor said, I didn't say that. I said, okay, so now we got that lined up perfectly. They want Oriole Park, and you want William Donald Schaefer Stadium. No, I don't. I didn't say that. I said, Governor, I think that's what you're referring to, but I understand. Can we just agree maybe that there's another way to do this? Maybe the smarter thing to do, Don, is to name the entire complex after you. Why do you just want the ballpark? Why wouldn't you want instead of the the Camden Yards complex, why couldn't it be the William Donald Schaefer complex? I don't want that. I said, we mean you don't want that. I don't want that. I said, okay, but then why don't you want Oriole Park? I don't want that. I said, geez, we're not getting anywhere, Governor. All right, well, I'll report back. So I go back to Lucchino and I tell him we're getting nowhere. He clearly wants you to name the ballpark after him. We're not doing that. I said, no, we're not doing that. But that's what he wants. You want Oriole Park, he's sticking on Camden Yards. So after another meeting or two, I go to the governor and I said, Governor, okay, I got an idea. I'm going to hold you to what you said. I've asked you now multiple times, do you want the stadium named after yourself? And you keep saying, no, I'm not saying that. And I take you at your word because you're a man of your word. I believe you. You want Camden Yards. The Orioles want Oriole Park. What if we put the names together? How about if we had Oriole Park at Camden Yards? Because it's the location's Camden Yards, the ballpark is Oriole Park. That would cure everybody's problems. He says, that's good. He thought, I think, that Lucchino would never go for it. I can't remember if it was Williams or
It was Eli Jacobs.
it's Jacobs. That Jacobs wouldn't go for it either. He in his mind thought it would never happen. But it did happen. Because when I went back and presented it, Larry, in his genius, started thinking to himself, Oriole Park at Camden Yards. We can monetize Oriole Park. We can monetize Camden Yards. We can have 2 sets of T-shirts, 2 sets of hats, 2 sets of licensing, 2 sets of protected product. Maybe that works. And they accepted it, contrary to, I think, what Schaefer ever expected in a million years that they accepted it. But they did. And I've always said that my law firm in the sports division was established on a preposition. I got paid to do that, which is kind of amazing. So that's the history of the name Oriole Park at Camden Yards. And it has turned out to be just that, incredibly valuable.
And then so afterwards, there's a circle named.
Okay, so that's the consolation prize. So Larry felt bad. I felt bad. We all felt bad. We tried a couple of other times to get him to agree to the complex being named the Schaefer. And by the way, there's a historical example of that. The Meadowlands was named after the governor, I can't think of his name, of New Jersey. What's that?
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah. Can't, no,
Irish
no. Can't think of his name. But anyway, Meadowlands did that, named it after the governor of the whole sports complex. So it could have been named after him. Brendan Burns. And they created the Brendan Burns Arena and all kinds of stuff to give homage to the governor. So we decided what we'll do is at least create an homage to the governor. We created the Schaefer Circle upon entrance, and he didn't show up when we had the naming of it. At least I don't recall him showing up when we had the naming of it. Yeah.
So just kind of just fast forward to the end right here with opening day
Yeah.
in Camden Yards.
Yeah.
Being an old school area built.
And I'll tell you a story before opening day. And I just told this story, by the way. Your old paper was silly enough to induct me into the Business Hall of Fame, Business Civic Hall of Fame. So with a big picture of Camden Yards in the photograph, which was nice, by the way. So in any case, I told the story there about a month ago about the day before. The day before Oriole Park opened, there was a gala honoring the opening where a lot of public officials were invited, a lot of the folks who participated in the development of Camden Yards. And I haven't gotten to the importance of Janet Marie Smith, which I will get to in a minute, and HOK. But all of them were there who did the incredible job of turning the 3 pieces of statutory language that we had gotten passed into that enormously successful, brilliant architectural icon to baseball. But the day before at the gala, I wanted to make a special point of finding Larry to congratulate him because, the common thread from beginning to end was Larry. And so I find him off in a corner. He's sort of just standing there in one of the suites, looking out over the ballpark and the event. And I said, Larry, I just got to say congratulations. You've got to be incredibly proud of having brought this thing to this point. And he looks at me and he says, I appreciate that, but it's a shared success. Everybody out here is part of this success. I think to myself, how gracious can you be to do something like that? So anyway, that's the full circle moment with Larry. Except he also then, years later, introduced me in front of the Major League Baseball owners group, which I thought was a great thing for him to have done.
What
Yeah.
was your impression of the stadium?
I was blown away, absolutely blown away. I'd watched it come up out of the ground, but until you're actually in there with people in the seats and see how it functioned, it's a masterpiece. And it only became a masterpiece because of Larry's faith in Janet Marie Smith. The story behind that is worth telling. Have you interviewed Janet?
Yes.
So Janet at the time, if I'm wrong on her age, she'll apologize. I'll apologize to her. In fact, she and I are working on another project today and just got off the phone driving in here. I think Janet is one of the great visual public space architects of our generation, of our time, probably beyond our time. Her ability to visualize how people move, what they need to be part of in a gathering space, a public gathering space, is second to none. But at the time, if I'm mistaken, I apologize, but I think she was about 24 years old. She had just graduated from Ole Miss and was studying public spaces and public stadium venues and things of that nature, and had reached out to Lucchino, knowing that there was going to be this stadium project built. And Larry had enough confidence in this very young, untried talent, visionary talent, to put her front and center as the owner's liaison to HOK in the development of Camden Yards. And what she brought to the table, along with Larry's support, is what made that thing so special. It could have been much different. The Stadium Authority, and to its credit, has a different job. Their job was to build something on budget, within the timeline, and to do it as expeditiously and cost effectively as possible. That led to a lot of fights and a lot of debates between Janet's vision, Larry's vision, and the Stadium Authority's vision. One of the biggest fights was over steel versus brick. Steel is quicker, better, faster, cheaper. Brick is expensive and time consuming. But in Janet's mind and Larry's mind, if you're going to have a throwback stadium, it had to be a brick facade. Yes, you could have structural steel, because that too is a throwback, but you couldn't have all steel, and you certainly didn't want concrete. And you wanted to have something that was part of the organic environment, which brick is part of the organic environment. And Janet fought very, very hard for that, incredibly hard for that, as she fought incredibly hard to keep the warehouse up. Today, people look at the warehouse and they think it was always to be part of the stadium, and this thing called the Utah Street Corridor was always to be part of the stadium. But that's just not true. It was never envisioned as part of the stadium. It wasn't even in my original budget. The warehouse was to be knocked down, and it was a rat-infested, derelict building that had no particular purpose or recourse, and it was blocking the view to the inner harbor. The stadium originally was to be facing more towards the inner harbor. But Janet had this vision, looking at the warehouse, along with her Belgrade, that could be iconic. And if it was cleaned up and fixed up and we could find the money somewhere to do it, it would be the signature element of this newfound urban ballpark, which was new anyway because nobody had built anything in an urban setting. But this would be how you integrate the urban setting into a ballpark the way they used to do it in the 1920s and 1930s. So she was adamant that money be found and it stay up, and so was Belgrade. The Baltimore newspapers, though, were dead set against it. A guy by the name of John Stedman, who was a writer for the News American, which is a paper long since gone, but very influential at its time, was just so against it that he railed on it every single week in the paper. And he claimed that the only reason it was being left up as part of the ballpark is because it was owned by cronies of William Donald Schaefer. It was owned by a bunch of guys who were big campaign contributors to Schaefer. That's a circumstantial fact. It led to an investigation, but it was a circumstantial fact. It was being left up because it was the right thing to do and because it would be iconic. But you had to have the vision. You had to see things the way Janet saw things. You had to see things to understand that if you build Camden Yards 21 feet below grade, that it has a more human element to it. You may not know it, but you'll know it the next time you walk into the ballpark. When you walk into Camden Yards, and if you're in the lower seating bowl, you walk down to your seats. Most stadiums, you walk in and you walk up. By walking down that 21 feet that they built the stadium down, the edifice on the outside looks human scale, doesn't look overwhelming. When you get in it, you feel comfortable, but you don't know why. It's those kinds of things, I won't say little because they're big, that you have to have a genius for it in order to understand how to construct, design, think through. And that's why it's stood the test of time. Janet's vision and her ability is incomprehensible. I brought her on when we were doing the spring training venue for the Orioles in Sarasota and had taken over the Cincinnati Reds facility there, which was at the time the ugliest ballpark in America. It was pre-Soviet architecture. And we knew we had to knock the whole thing down. I brought Janet in and I said, Janet, you figure out what to do. And she designed this most gorgeous, throwback, old Florida style stadium that, again, you think has been there for 150 years.
If you had to give one person credit for designing the stadium, who would it
Oh,
be?
it's Janet. Oh, listen, Joe Spear and HOK get a lot of credit for a lot of the structural, trying to fit it into an urban complex, understanding how to work within this very tight spacing and space. But Janet's touch is everywhere, absolutely everywhere, from the scroll of the B on the side of each one of the rows of seats to the ironwork that's above the scoreboard. Every one of those little touches, she spent days thinking about.
And my last question is opening day.
Yeah.
Where were you?
Where was I?
Where do you remember? What do you remember?
I was in and out of various of the boxes in the club section, the Orioles, the State, various different places. Couldn't sit. I was excited, nervous, couldn't sit. Was walking around. My wife was with me, going in and out. Probably didn't enjoy 1 minute of the ball game, but it's one of those things where no one will ever remember what you did, or how it went from a piece of paper or an idea, to the stadium. But I know, and so every time I drive past it, even on opening day, but every time thereafter, you get a sense of accomplishment. How can you not? But my role at the end of the day was a handoff. I had no idea what it was going to look like. Nobody could have ever told you what it was going to look like. The authorization and funding and land acquisition sort of was the canvas, but the painting was yet to be painted. And it's Janet and Larry Lucchino and Joe Spear and HOK and all the folks at the MSA. And by the way, MSA was terrific. They may have had their few issues, but by and large, this is how they made their reputation too. What they painted on the canvas is amazing. And I'm also very proud that the MSA has survived all this time. We created it for one purpose, and now it's become the gold standard of stadium authorities throughout the country. And really talented people have worked there and still work there from the beginning to the end. So yeah.
Sandy, do you have anything?
I do. What did William say when he was asked what happens if you die?
You have to look at the.
Is the video
yeah,
pretend
it's in there. I think what he said was, I think what he said was, we all are going to pass away at some point. I'm here to tell you what I'm willing to do, which is commit to you and commit to the city if you build the stadium. But I don't want you to think I'm doing it because of that. Something like that. He just did it so elegantly. You'd have to get the exact, you can pull it out through the CD. Yeah.
So we have that.
You have the video. Yeah. It's definitely worth watching. And you'll find in that CD, somebody who looks like me, much younger, is sitting at the table. And right behind me is Larry Lucchino, to my right or left of my shoulder. It was Wednesday. It was a Wednesday, because it was Ash Wednesday. So it was the Wednesday that the hearing was. It was Ash Wednesday because you'll see he's got ash on his forehead. So, all right, now that mystery is now solved.
Good. No,
It was a Wednesday.
I think
Yes.
it was March 30th or something.
That sounds about right. And the press conference was probably the preceding Thursday. Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah.
I want to know more about Lucchino.
Yeah.
His reputation is, he was, what's the word I want? Vicious isn't the right word. Tough. Let's start with something simple like tough.
Yeah, he
What
was.
did you see?
Oh, he was. Oh my God, he was. Sure. But he wasn't. There are all kinds of gradations of people who are tough on the exterior or difficult or demanding. There are those that are demanding or difficult for no purpose other than to show that they've got influence, power, or ability to do it. Then there are those who are difficult, tough, and demanding because they have a vision, they believe in themselves, and they believe that you can do it or you can make it happen. That was the Larry. Schaefer was exactly the same way. Schaefer was not a stroll in the park. He was demanding and difficult and would change his mind, in a moment. They had a lot of similarities, the two of them, but they always had the vision of beyond their own needs or wants. Larry didn't do anything for his own aggrandizement. Schaefer did nothing for his own aggrandizement. So if you understood that, the other stuff would just roll off your shoulders. You can be called every name or whatever you want to, and then you just look and go, okay, Larry, what are you trying to get at here? What are we trying to accomplish?
And what more did you know about Edward Bennett Williams? Did you just
I
know
didn't
about
get to know, I didn't get to know him a lot because he passed away pretty soon thereafter. First off, I knew him by reputation before I ever met him. He was considered to be the finest lawyer in America, and any lawyer, young or old, would have been enamored to just meet him, much less get yelled at by him, or to go through this kind of a battle with him. So the first time I met him was at the mansion. I had been on a phone call with him preceding the one with David. That, thank goodness, David picked up the phone, not me. But I'd been on another call with him and Schaefer about a month earlier, which was full of pleasantries, but nothing that got anywhere. When I met him, I was enamored with the fact that he was doing this after chemotherapy. Anybody who's ever had a relative or a friend or seen anybody go through that knows just how difficult it was, and then to get on an airplane and fly in to do what he did. But then my admiration for him went through the roof when I watched him give his presentation. You guys will watch it, you'll see. But now that you know the backdrop, most of the people who were listening in the legislature, in the audience, they had no idea he had just had chemotherapy treatment. I don't know that we made a big deal. In fact, I'm pretty sure we didn't tell anybody. You might want to ask David this. I can't remember.
You can look up, I don't remember writing it.
I don't believe we told anybody. I thought we may have kept that to ourselves. I'm pretty sure we did, because otherwise I think we would have had another series of problems in compromising somebody's, personal health. We probably did not tell anybody. So they would have had no idea when he got up there to testify. That's remarkable in and of itself.
Yeah. Oh my
I did go back to see the governor after the hearing, though, which was kind of
What
interesting.
happened that night? So after the hearing, there's a sense in the hearing.
Well, then they voted.
So
Oh,
let's let them do
it went even more than that. Then they voted. We should have talked about this.
Yeah.
The vote was not a fait
What was
accompli.
that night? No.
The vote was that night, that
Committee
afternoon.
votes, the committee votes.
Committee vote. So after the hearing, so the hearing started around 2. We probably finished the hearing around 4:30. And then the committees went back into their committee rooms to vote. The first committee to vote was the Budget and Tax Committee. It was a joint referral in the Senate to Budget and Tax and Finance, and it was a joint referral in the House, Appropriations and somebody, Economic Matters, I think. The first committee to vote was the Senate Budget and Tax Committee, and I was afraid it wasn't going to pass. My last straw vote in that committee had it losing 7-6 to a bunch of very diehard conservatives who did not believe in spending public funds. And Lapidus was on that committee, Jack Cade was on that committee, a lot of very hardline, a guy by the name of Smelser, very, very hardline guys that didn't want to spend any public dollars for millionaires at the time. At the time, these guys weren't billionaires, but they were wealthy. And spending money on them was not something these legislators wanted to do. So my last straw vote had it losing 7-6. So I went to see Frank Kelly, Senator Frank Kelly, which I hope you have interviewed or you will interview. Frank was an interesting guy.
So he's on budget and tax.
He's on Budget and Tax. Frank is, I think he might have been vice chairman. Frank is a Republican, a very conservative Republican. So you wouldn't have expected him to do anything that a Democratic governor would have wanted. He happened to be a very good friend of mine, still is to this day a very good friend of mine. I admire him enormously. He's a very honest, God-fearing man who says what he believes and has a reason for it, and he's never tries to be harmful to anyone. And he's always open to thoughtful discussion. And he liked Schaefer, and Schaefer liked him. But I had thought he was going to vote against it. So I went to see went to see Frank, and over the course of a couple of days before the hearing, and then again the day of the hearing. And we had a lot of very good conversations, and he said, "I'll help you. I will vote for this. I will help you." And where I needed help was with this chairman, Larry Levitan. Levitan was betwixt and between about whether to vote for it. He's from Montgomery County. The pressure was enormous in Montgomery County to kill what they called the Baltimore bailout, which is what they were calling the stadium, the bailout. And he knew that if he voted, Larry Levitan, if he voted for the stadium bill, he was likely to get thrown out of office. But because Frank Kelly was willing to vote yes, even though he had all the trepidations that a Republican conservative would have, I asked him to please go talk to Larry and see if he could get Larry to be comfortable enough to vote. So he said he would, but he wanted me to go with him. So the two of us went from Frank's office over to Larry's office. Frank said, "Larry, I'm going to vote for the bill. We need you, otherwise it's going to fail." Larry said, "Let me think through it. I'm pretty sure, but let me think through it." And as the vote went around, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, it gets to the two chairmen. And if either one of them, the Vice Chairman Frank Kelly or Chairman Levitan, vote no, it's over. Kelly votes yes, and Larry votes yes, 7-6. People don't realize that's all it was 7-6. Then it went to Senate Finance, and it was pretty much a blowout there. But it also, we ran into a filibuster on the Senate floor. Another place it could have been disastrously lost. The filibuster lasted almost 6.5 hours, went until around 2 in the morning, 1 in the morning, before we had all these great things the next morning with the press and the balls being thrown around. It only passed by 1 vote on the Senate floor. And the swing vote was a guy by the name of Michael Collins, a Democrat from Baltimore County. The story behind why he was a swing vote is almost too hard to imagine, but true. He had spent his whole life being a second bencher. Nice guy, funny, talented, smart, but he had never been in leadership. In fact, he always used to say, I'm not leadership material, I'm fellowship material. Okay, so he gets to the point where he realizes that this thing could be deadlocked, and he could be the swing vote, which could make him really, really important. So he decides to be the swing vote. He won't let anybody know how he's going to vote. It's tied. Can't get out of the filibuster. It's tied. So he comes up into my office and he goes, you know I'm the swing vote. I said, yeah. He says, what can the governor do for me? I said, I don't know. Michael, I don't know. What do you want? He looks around my room and I had a plant and a poster. The plant was half dead. The poster was nondescript, but he wanted to play a game. So he says, I want that and I want that. I said, you want the poster and the plant? He says, I want the poster and the plant. I said, take them. So are you going to vote for it? He said, I was always going to vote for it now, but now I got your poster, now I got your plant. And sure enough, he voted for it and the thing passed. He just wanted to be important for a couple hours.
The final vote, the final Senate vote was not one vote, was it?
I think it wound up being 3.
Yeah.
What happens is, as you know, Sandy, once you break the tide, then everybody wants to jump to the winner. It might have been more than 3 at the time. But at the time, before the vote, it was tied.
And the House was open.
Yeah, House was pretty much okay, yeah.
Who were the baseball signed by?
Oh, all kinds of people. I will tell you one more quick story about that. What's I going to tell you about? Oh, one more quick story just to wrap up Julian Lapidus. So Lapidus is the guy they asked the question, if I recall right, to Williams. He's the guy that was a big thorn in our side, was against it, and still voted against it in budget and tax. When the stadium opened, fast forward, I'm now outside counsel of the Orioles. Stadium's open. Opening day's about to come. Everybody wants to get a ticket. Everybody wants to show up to the game. I get a call, and it's from Julian Lapidus. And he says, Senator Lapidus here. I said, well, hi, Julian. He says, you got 2 extra tickets for me? Thinking to myself, Julian, you need to call Larry Lucchino on that one. I don't know whether he got his ticket or not. I have no idea. But the audacity of that was just kind of mind-numbing me. Who are they signed by? All kinds of people. All right, let's see. This is Cal Ripken. I am on the Cal Ripken board.
So how come Cal won't talk to us? We can't get past John Maroon.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I can certainly ask him.
Yeah. John Maroon keeps sending messages saying, we already said no. But I don't know if that's John Maroon saying no.
Don't know the answer. This is Brooks Robinson, my dear friend, Eddie Murray. That's from John Unitas, which turned out to be another client of mine over the years. Just fun stuff. Fun stuff.
What else?
I think we covered a lot right
We
there.
did.
Actually, no, I do have one more. This is with Kurt Schmoke,
Oh, yeah.
because you were there with Governor Schaefer, but Governor Schaefer wasn't the mayor of Baltimore when this was happening in the late 80s.
Correct.
It was Kurt Schmoke who
Correct.
we interviewed. How did you view that relationship and that Kurt Schmoke?
How did I view the relationship? I can tell you how Schaefer viewed the relationship. Schaefer viewed that there should never be another mayor in the history of the city of Baltimore after he left. It wouldn't make a difference who was the next mayor. He wasn't going to like him because they might do something good that they would get credit for, and he didn't want them to get any credit because he did all the good. I'm not saying this to be mean or hard-hearted to my friend William Donald Schaefer, but in his view, there could never be another mayor. Schmoke was a great mayor and a great person, and is a great person of integrity and ability and vision and leadership, but that wasn't going to help him with Schaefer. They just didn't get along. But not because Schmoke didn't get along with him. Schmoke would have been happy to be his friend. Schaefer didn't want to be Schmoke's friend.
And we heard from Schmoke that there's virtually no communication from each
We
side.
didn't even ask them about the $1.5 million that we were going to take out of their budget to help support, because Schaefer just said, you don't need to ask them, just do it. Yeah.
Did you know when Dew Burns at the hearing,
Uh-huh.
and he of course came totally at the end, by then, nobody cared anymore.
Yeah.
And he said, we're gonna give $1 million a year.
Oh,
And
so
that
so he
seemed-
grabbed it? He
that
grabbed him
seemed
out?
to-
Maybe it was $1 million, not $1.5 million. I can't remember. It was one of the two.
Whatever, it
Yeah.
seemed to catch his staff by surprise.
Well, of course, we didn't tell anybody.
So did Mayor Burns know?
We had testified to it. When, in my testimony,
Yeah.
in outlining the financials piece of it, I laid it out. So that might have been the first time it was laid out.
Oh my God.
It could have been. I can't recall if we told anybody ahead of time how we were funding until we got to that bill during the hearing.
Because it surprised us. What's he doing?
Well, sure, because every time I went public with what the funding was, I lost it. So I think at some point you learn, just don't discuss it.
Right.
Just get it done.
So years later, this is about
Uh-huh.
we have a class, a summer class, Summer Baltimore Urban Affairs.
Uh-huh.
Class, and we were trying to figure out